Day, fresher air with us for most of us. Temperatures back close to normal. Sunny spells and a few showers moving in across western areas. And the weekend, a lot of bright weather, quite a bit of cloud, some sunny spells and temperatures back to normal, which means more comfortable night's sleep ahead.
The Queen's speech in Westminster, it is dominated by Brexit as the government sets out its agenda for the next 2 years. It was a scaled-back state opening. The Queen arrived by car rather than carriage for the first time since 1974 to deliver the Queen's speech.
My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union.
27 bills have been announced. 8 concern Brexit, among the others proposals on terror legislation and domestic violence. Prince Charles accompanied the Queen after the Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to hospital last night for precautionary treatment. Very little pomp and ceremony because of the timing of the state opening, squeezed in before the Queen's engagement at Royal Ascot.
Yeah, get your skates on. First race is 2:30.
Not mentioned in the Queen's speech, Conservative manifesto pledges on social care and grammar schools, and no mention of Donald Trump's planned state visit.
And the other main stories this lunchtime. It could be a record-breaking midsummer's day, with temperatures in parts of the UK expected to hit a 40-year high. And triple Oscar winner Sir Daniel Day-Lewis announces he's retiring from acting after a glittering career.
Coming up in the sport later in the hour on BBC News, after 6 games on tour, some tough choices for Warren Gatland. He's going to name his Lions 15 to face the All Blacks later today.
Good afternoon from Westminster, where the Queen has delivered the government's legislative programme for the next 2 years at the state opening of Parliament. The Queen's speech was dominated by Brexit, with a host of proposed new laws designed to pave the way for a smooth and orderly exit from the European Union. But many of the Prime Minister's general election pledges were not included after the Conservatives lost their overall majority in the Commons. The timing of the state opening meant that it was a very scaled-back affair with no royal carriage procession, and the Queen was accompanied by Prince Charles instead of the Duke of Edinburgh after he was taken to hospital last night. More on that in a moment. But first, here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier.
No golden carriage and no horses. This is a dressed-down Queen's speech. The crown not worn, but travelling to Parliament in a car of its own. With a crowded calendar and little time for preparations, the full pomp and ceremony has been slimmed down.
Close the door!
Following centuries of tradition, Blackrod sent to summon MPs to the Lords. Theresa May had hoped to be commanding a strong majority. Instead, she's been left turning to the DUP for support. And it's the Labour leader who's been left looking more confident of the two. The Duke of Edinburgh, normally a constant at the Queen's side, today ill in hospital as Her Majesty delivered the Queen's speech for the 64th time.
My government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union.
Brexit is the central theme. 8 bills devoted to the complex process of pulling out of the EU, covering areas like immigration, agriculture and trade.
My government will seek to maintain a deep and special partnership with the European allies and to forge new trading relationships across the globe.
But this is a moderated version of Theresa May's manifesto. No mention of Tory plans to expand grammar schools and controversial proposals to overhaul social care funding reduced only to a consultation. There are 27 bills and draft bills in Theresa May's first Queen's speech, including measures for a review of counter-terrorism to deal with extremists and protect the public. A draft domestic violence and abuse bill to bring in new protection and sentencing powers, plus legislation to update and strengthen data protection laws, giving people more control over their data.
The Queen's speech itself looks at what we need to do in order to deliver Brexit, which is clearly something we have to do, the country voted on, but it's also about delivering that economic prosperity and fairness through society.
But Labour said not enough was mentioned about investing more in public services.
We've had 7 years of this Conservative austerity, and I think this was a very big factor in the general election and why Theresa May did not get the majority that she wanted, and yet we've seen no recognition of that.
The SNP accused the government of hollow words over Brexit.
We've heard the same tired old language, securing the best deal possible, but no detail in what that means. The speech says that the government are committed to working with the devolved governments and business, but we need action on this, not words.
After failing to win a majority at the general election, Theresa May has said her government will respond to the message from voters with humility and resolve. But the lack of support means delivering this 2-year plan for government will be a day-by-day fight for survival in Parliament. The Queen has now fulfilled her duties, but the tasks for the Prime Minister are stacking up. 11 days on, there's still no deal with the DUP. And Theresa May knows, having effectively lost the Tory crown, delivering this programme for government will be difficult. Ellen Agagna, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, I'm joined now by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. So it was dominated by Brexit, but how much do we know now, or how much more do we know about the form it will take?
Well, Sophie, I can't actually recall a Queen's speech in recent years so shorn of pretty much all major domestic legislation beyond Brexit. And yes, of course, there are important bills on providing more support for victims of domestic violence, cracking down on insurance fraud, a new advocate to represent bereaved victims after disasters like Grenfell Tower. But all the standout, emblematic, symbolic policies in the manifesto have basically gone or been shelved. So grammar schools gone, social care, the cap on energy bills passed off to a consultation. And that is not just because Mrs May lacks a majority, it is because of Brexit. Brexit is this huge, gargantuan, massive task that is risking squeezing the life out of this Parliament, leaving no time or energy or political wherewithal to do anything else. And it sort of sits like a great big hungry heffalump on top of Parliament. And it represents a real threat too to Mrs May, because she has to get through 8 Brexit bills, all hugely complex, hugely detailed, providing a mine of opportunity for the opposition parties and the critics in her own parties to cause her all sorts of grief. And the real unanswered question is this: would defeat on any one of those bills be tantamount to a vote of no confidence in Mrs May? And many at Westminster believe it would.
Norman Smith for now, thank you. Well, Prince Phillip did not accompany the Queen this morning as expected. Buckingham Palace announced that he had been admitted to hospital last night for treatment as a precautionary measure. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell is at Royal Ascot, where the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were both expected later today. The Queen is on her way there, but the Duke of Edinburgh in hospital, Nick, and we're told that it is precautionary.
The most important thing to say, I think, is that there is absolutely no sense of alarm among royal officials. Now, the Duke was with the Queen yesterday at the opening day of Royal Ascot. He was with her also on Saturday at the Trooping the Colour ceremony. Both very hot days. That may be significant. He was taken by road last night from Windsor Castle to the King Edward VII Hospital in London for what officials are describing is a precautionary measure for treatment to an infection arising from a precautionary measure for treatment to an infection arising from a pre-existing condition, they say. Now, 5 years ago, he was twice admitted to hospital for a bladder infection. The following year, 2013, he had exploratory surgery on his abdomen. He made a good recovery from that, and his health in the last few years has been good. However, he is 96. However, according to officials, he is in good spirits in hospital. He's been up and about, disappointed at not being able to accompany the Queen to the state opening of Parliament, or indeed to be at Royal Ascot this afternoon. However, the Queen will be here in less than an hour for the carriage ride down the course, and I think the fact that she is continuing with her programme unchanged sends the strongest possible signal that there is no cause for undue concern.
Nick Witchell at Ascot, thank you. So the Queen's speech this morning dominated by Brexit, but the Queen also announced a review of the government's counter-terror strategy following the recent attacks in Manchester and in London. It comes as Britain's most senior counter-terror officer delivered a stark warning to ministers over the impact on the police force as they attempt to contain the unprecedented threat. Our correspondent Johnny Diamond reports.
Behind the soldiers in their crisp dress uniforms, shirt-sleeved armed police stand guard. Spotters keep watch over the Palace of Westminster from every vantage point. Everywhere reminders, if they were needed, of the heightened state of alert. This is the police response to terror. From inside the palace came the response of the government.
In the light of the terrorist attacks in Manchester and London, my government's counter-terrorism strategy will be reviewed to ensure that the police and security services have all the powers they need, and that the length of custodial sentences for terrorism-related offences are sufficient to keep the population safe.
But the police have more urgent concerns. Britain's top counter-terror police officer, Mark Rowley, wrote to the Home Secretary last week. He told her that prioritising counter-terror would involve difficult choices. He warned of a potentially significant impact on other police operations. And he asked the Home Secretary to avoid uncertainty over funding so the police could plan properly. From the head of London's police today came an admission that policing terror was stretching the Met.
We are shifting resources and people across the Met. This does have an impact on other, for example, investigations. We've had to pause some, we've had to slow down on some, and that's just a necessity.
The government says it has boosted money to counter terror, but the police say they are stretched. To all the challenges, police chiefs have added another: the resources to keep crime under control. Johnny Diamond, BBC News.
Well, social care and how to pay for it was a major plank of the Conservatives' election campaign, but today's Queen's speech made little of it. Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt joins me now. So has it all been shelved?
Well, we're told that no, it hasn't been shelved, but there is no real detail, certainly not in the Queen's speech, and the language that we're here being used more generally. I would say there's been a shift in tone there from what we were hearing during much of the election. The language is of building widespread support, discussions across the care sector, a wider public debate. It's the sort of language of building a consensus that we heard from the other main parties during the election in their manifestos. The government describes this as one of the most profound issues facing the nation, and there are certainly many people who would say you've actually got to get politicians working together if you're ever going to solve the very real problems that social care has. There is no direct mention of a cap on care costs, of the higher care costs, and this was the issue that proved so toxic for the Tories when it wasn't mentioned in the manifesto. But we're told that there will be consultation on a cap and that it will happen. In fact, legislation is already there if they choose to use it. But the big question is, how swiftly do they go from consultation to action? Because many people say the crisis is there now, and the fear is that consultation can be just one way of kicking a difficult issue into the long grass.
Alison Holt, thank you. Well, there is no mention either in the Queen's speech of another big Conservative manifesto pledge to end the ban on new grammar schools. Instead, the Queen said the government would work to ensure that every child has the opportunity to attend a good school and that all schools are fairly funded. It comes as a group of head teachers in England are writing to parents about what they call the growing funding crisis in schools. Our education correspondent Gillian Hargreaves reports.
These boys are from the 5% of the school children of England and Wales.
Unashamedly traditional, unashamedly elitist. Grammar schools may have provided a rigorous academic education for the most able children, but selection at the age of 11 divided opinion, with many saying it was unfair to those children who didn't get in, which is why 20 years ago, Labour stopped more being built.
What do you think is going to happen?
But then Theresa May became Prime Minister, and she promised a new generation of these types of schools, saying grammars would be a way of helping the poorest children improve their life chances. But that was before a general election that left the Conservatives weakened.
I think grammar schools have been controversial in the Conservative Party as well as in the other parties. So Theresa May would have needed a healthy Tory majority in the House of Commons to push this policy through. And the fact is she's lost a majority and therefore lost the opportunity to take this policy forward.
The government has hinted it will look at the issue of school funding, which caused widespread protest among parents and teachers who said schools need more money. In the election campaign, it was an issue on the doorsteps.
We're going to see larger class sizes from September. We're going to see fewer subject choices from September unless the government acts urgently to tell head teachers that they will be getting a funding uplift. We want that to happen very, very soon.
However, the Queen's speech didn't mention a Conservative manifesto proposal to scrap free school lunches for infant pupils in England. Again, it was unpopular with voters, and with no majority in the House of Commons, it would be difficult to reverse a policy introduced 3 years ago. Gillian Hargreaves, BBC News.
Well, laws relating to Brexit will dominate the new parliamentary session, which will cover the next 2 years. Reality Check's Chris Morris looks now at the scale of the task ahead.
It was billed as the Brexit election, even though it didn't always feel that way. But now the UK's departure from the EU is set to dominate the next parliament.
Inevitably, the Queen's speech, the biggest chunk is of bills relating to Brexit. That's the overwhelming issue facing the government and parliament over the next 2 years.
And as the government embarks on the most daunting set of negotiations this country has faced in decades, so too this new parliament, with no strong governing majority, will have to deal with an unprecedented legislative challenge. The main piece of legislation has been named by the government as the Great Repeal Bill, and yes, it will repeal the European Communities Act and take us out of the EU. But its main purpose is really to transpose thousands and thousands of EU rules and regulations into British law, potentially as many as 20,000 pieces of legislation. The idea is to avoid a legal and financial vacuum when we leave. You're also going to be hearing quite a bit about this guy, Henry VIII. A Henry VIII clause allows the government to repeal or amend primary legislation without further parliamentary scrutiny. You can sneak it through when no one's looking. And in the Brexit process, that could prove controversial. And then there are a series of bills which will need to be passed as a result of Brexit. We need a new immigration policy, a new trade policy. There'll be a customs bill, new policies on agriculture and fisheries. Then we need a new international sanctions policy, and there'll be a nuclear safeguards bill because we're going to be leaving the EU's nuclear agency. Now, right now, we know very little detail on any of these bills, but they are going to be the nuts and bolts of Brexit, and they will keep this Parliament extremely busy.
So it will be a really big task to not only manage the Great Repeal Bill, but these other bills that will be really important to shaping life after Brexit.
And there's the rub. The government has got to push all this through with the most unstable majority imaginable. Expect rebellions, threats and uncertainty. Chris Morris, BBC News.
There is so much to get through Parliament over the next 2 years, and that task is going to be even more difficult for the Conservatives without their parliamentary majority. And there is still no official deal between the Democratic Unionists and the minority Conservative government. Our Northern Ireland political editor, Mark Devonport, joins me here. When is a deal expected and what is holding it up?
Well, there have been some speculation that we could have an announcement on a deal as soon as tomorrow morning. There is a DUP ruling executive meeting in Belfast tomorrow night, and the thought was maybe they were going to rubber stamp whatever had been announced already during the day. But just during the course of today, we've heard from some senior ministers acknowledging that a deal may not be possible, and we know that there are some big financial asks from the DUP, and that might be causing some problems in the Treasury.
Asks like?
Well, for instance, talk about £1 billion in extra health funding for Northern Ireland, £1 billion in extra infrastructure spending. Now, we don't know whether that's the precise ask, and we don't know quite what the government's response has been, but you can imagine that in relation to that and in relation to other DUP demands, which might be to do with lowering corporation tax locally or cutting air passenger duty, they've all got financial consequences, possible knock-on effects elsewhere in the UK, and the government, with its narrow majority, will know that it will come in for severe criticism if it's looking to buy the votes of the DUP.
Indeed, Mark. Thank you very much. Well, that is all from us here in Westminster for now. We'll be back later in the programme, but now it's back to Ben in the studio.
Thanks, Sophie. The time is just approaching 1:20. Our top story this lunchtime. The government has set out the range of measures it hopes to bring into law over the next 2 years, with Brexit at the top of the agenda. And still to come, Taxi for Travis, the chief executive of Uber, has resigned following months of turmoil at the company.
Coming up in sport later on BBC News, England's cricketers are back in action later today. They're in Southampton, playing the first of 3 2020 matches against South Africa.
The UK could be experiencing its hottest June day for more than 40 years, with temperatures in some parts forecast to soar to 34 degrees later today. Well, the heatwave has seen 5 sizzling days in a row, with temperatures topping 30 degrees since Saturday. Our correspondent Duncan Kennedy reports for us now from Reading.
The sight and sound of summer. At the Stones, where dawn and legend combine in almost mystical unison. And where around 13,000 people came to the Stonehenge solstice. It was a different kind of tradition underway at the Embrook Court shelter in Berkshire. NHS England has asked elderly people especially to be careful of this kind of heat.
How much heat can you take?
Not a lot. I'm one of these people that if I have any time worthwhile talking about in the sun, then I feel like a rotten banana.
What do you make of these temperatures?
Very hot.
Too hot?
Too hot, yes.
In many places, the only breeze is man-made. And when it comes to potential records being broken, in Reading, they were reading all about it.
Is it uncomfortable, this kind of temperature, when we're around the 30-degree mark? Is that too much?
No, I can cope with it, yeah. I mean, you just take a few more clothes off, don't you? Gets embarrassing eventually.
You need a special kind of coat to attempt this. The official advice is be very careful of swimming in open water. But are we heading for a record-breaking June?
The temperatures today are expected to rise between 33 and 34 degrees. If we get to 33.9, then it will be the warmest June day since 1976.
But as always, we're one country divided by a common summer. This was Newcastle this morning. Southern areas have so far missed that. Here, the long stretch of sun still playing out across the longest of days.
We're already at 31 degrees here in Berkshire. Elsewhere, the temperatures are also climbing. But whether we're going to get to that mystical 34 degrees we last saw in 1976, it's still not clear. As you've seen already in other parts of the country, in more northerly areas, the weather is breaking down a bit with some of those thundery storms. Here in the south, the sun is expected to continue for a wee while longer, Ben. But even here, temperatures are expected to drop a little over the next few days.
Thank you, Duncan. The bomb set off at Brussels' busiest railway station last night consisted of nails and gas bottles placed inside a suitcase. Prosecutors say the suspect shouted and set off a partial explosion, which was then followed by a more violent blast. A soldier patrolling nearby shot and killed the suspect, who was a 36-year-old Moroccan. No one else was injured. The charity single for the victims and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire has been released this morning. The version of Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water features artists including Paloma Faith, Robbie Williams and Rita Ora. Simon Cowell organised the recording after a visit to the Tower block, which he says left a big impact on him. The founder of Uber, Travis Kalanick, has resigned as chief executive after mounting unrest about the company's business methods. Uber has persistently attracted controversy, including problems with regulators and protests by established taxi firms and drivers in the cities in which it operates. Rory Kathleen-Jones has this report.
It's on a mission to change the way we see city transport. But around the world, Uber has clashed with regulators and taxi drivers wherever it's gone, and has seemed relaxed about that. But now its chief executive Travis Kalanick, who set the tone for the company's hard-charging culture, has resigned. When he visited London 3 years ago, I asked him about his company's reputation.
Everywhere you go around the world, frankly, you're making enemies. Why do you think that is?
It's not exactly true. What we've seen is opposition specifically from the taxi industry, taxi companies.
But beyond the external clashes, it was the way Uber treated its own staff which finally did for the chief executive. Allegations of a culture where bullying and sexual harassment were tolerated appear to have convinced investors that change was needed. But that's taken some time.
They have been in violation over and over and over again of state rules, country rules, people's trust, and nothing has happened to them. And I think part of the reason is because they were making money. So the investors were more driven by short-term returns than long-term considerations.
Uber's ambitions are unlikely to become more modest. It's trying out self-driving cars on American roads. But having backed the company with huge sums, its investors now want clear evidence that it's heading in the right direction. Rory Kathleen-Jones, BBC News.
The star of stage and screen, Sir Daniel Day-Lewis, has announced his retirement from acting. Sir Daniel turned 60 this year and is the only man to have won 3 Best Actor Oscars. He won his Academy Awards for My Left Foot, There Will Be Blood and Lincoln. Here's our arts correspondent, David Sillitoe.
February the 1st, I intend to sign the 13th Amendment.
Lincoln was textbook Daniel Day-Lewis, the actor almost disappearing into the character of the president.
I am the President of the United States, clothed in immense power.
And it achieved something that no one had ever done before, a 3rd Best Actor Oscar.
I think Daniel Day-Lewis will be remembered as one of the best actors of all time. He's absolutely terrific. He invests himself in every role. He goes the extra mile, and you really see the results on screen.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I say I'm an oil man, you will agree. I'm a family man.
There Will Be Blood was another Oscar winner, but it appears his career is now over. A statement from his spokesman simply says he will no longer be working as an actor. There's no explanation, but it's long been clear he has doubts about fame, and that phrase, invests himself in every role, is shorthand for an actor who takes the process very seriously. In My Left Foot, fellow actors said he stayed in character, in the wheelchair, throughout the shoot.
This is fresh meat.
He learned butchery for Gangs of New York, but increasingly he seemed to prefer the time he spent not acting.
And whether I like it or not, a public figure during certain periods like now. Then I disappear, it seems, to people from the outside. I seem to disappear. But of course, in my experience, I don't disappear. I'm just doing other things.
There is one final film awaiting release, but after that, it's thank you and goodbye. David Sillitoe, BBC News.
OK, that's it from me. Let's return now to Sophie at Westminster.
Ben, thank you very much. Yes, welcome back to Westminster, where the Queen has delivered the government's legislative programme for the next 2 years. Brexit is at the top of the agenda. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, joins me again. Now, this is certainly not the Queen's speech that the Prime Minister would have been expecting, and what a task she has ahead now.
Sophie, it's hugely difficult, not just for Mrs May, but maybe for all of us, because what this perhaps inevitable focus on Brexit means is so many of the pressing issues we face as a country, be it on the NHS or social care or the deficit, risk being squeezed, not getting the attention they deserve because of this remorseless focus on Brexit. But for Mrs May, this is profoundly dangerous territory, and the sort of word that older Westminster lags mutter under their breath with dread is Maastricht. Now, older viewers will know Maastricht was the EU bill which John Major, when he was Prime Minister, had to get through Parliament in the 1990s, and it caused him untold grief. It was like pulling teeth without an anaesthetic. But that was one bill. Theresa May has got to get 8 bills through. John Major had a parliamentary majority. Theresa May does not have a parliamentary majority. And the real danger for Theresa May is the turmoil and the upheaval that John Major faced will be as nothing to that which Theresa May faces, which may well make Maastricht look like a walk in the park.
Norman Smith, thank you. Let's have a look at the weather now with Chris Fawkes. Hot, hot, hot. It certainly is.
Yes, Sophie, indeed. We've already seen temperatures of 31 degrees. It is going to be the hottest day of the year so far. And if we get another 3 degrees Celsius, up to 34, it'll be the hottest June day for 40 years. It's going to be much hotter as well across the Midlands, northeast England, where yesterday it was quite cloudy. Today we've got the sunshine, and that's making the difference. Weather Watch has been out snapping some clouds. This cloud is a cloud called Alticumulus castellanis. It's one that we often get before big summertime thunderstorms break out, and that's a clue as to what the weather prospects hold for us over the next 24 hours. For the time being, though, a lot of dry weather for the Midlands, East Anglia, southern counties of England. Barely a cloud in the sky for many areas, with those temperatures pushing up to that 34-degree mark. 1 or 2 thunderstorms are possible across Wales and northern counties of England through the course of this afternoon, maybe 1 or 2 as well for southern Scotland and also for Northern Ireland. But across northern Scotland, it's just rather grey with bursts of rain on and off. Temperatures generally high teens to low 20s here. Following such a hot day, another very hot evening coming up. Heading to bed, 10 o'clock, those temperatures still up at 26 degrees Celsius. But there are signs of a change taking place. The hot air in place at the moment is going to get run over the top with colder air coming in off the Atlantic, and this makes some very big temperature contrasts building up in the atmosphere. It's a recipe for some pretty lively fireworks later on from the atmosphere. Now, there are going to be some scattered thunderstorms. Not everyone will see them, but if you do catch one, could have torrential rain, gusty winds, and maybe some large hail as well. The atmosphere is very chaotic, so where exactly these storms occur is still open to a bit of doubt, but across Wales, Midlands, northern England, that's probably where we'll see the first batch of storms come through overnight, and then later the risk extends in across the Midlands into eastern parts of England through Thursday. By Thursday, though, those temperatures will be getting back closer to normal for many areas. However, it'll still be pretty warm and still fairly humid across parts of eastern England, up to 26 degrees in London, so we're still on the warm side. Here's Friday's picture. Bright skies for many of us, a few showers, particularly across northwestern areas, and those temperatures will continue to just fall away a little bit. So closer to average, which means more comfortable nights for getting some decent sleep. The weekend weather prospects, again, a lot of dry and bright weather with some sunny spells coming and going, and those temperatures pretty close to average for the time of year. So, yes, today is going to be the hottest day of the year so far, perhaps the hottest June day for 40 years, but the heatwave is going to end with a bang, with big thunderstorms on the way for some of us. And keep up to date on the temperatures through this afternoon on the BBC Twitter account, at BBC Weather. That's the weather from me, Sophie.
Chris, thank you very much. And that is all from the BBC News at 1 on another big day in Westminster. It is goodbye from me on BBC One. We now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Have a very nice afternoon. Bye-bye.